Welcome to our latest webinar. The subject of today's webinar is the New World Order after Coronavirus. Will the pandemic accelerate China's dominance on the world stage? And we're very pleased to be joined today by Sir Martin Donnelly and Will Hutton. Will Hutton is a British academic and journalist. He's currently principal of Hertford College, University of Oxford, an observer columnist, author of 7 books, including The Writing on the Wall about China, and he co-chairs the Purposeful Company, the most recent of 4 think tanks that he has chaired, co-founded or led over the last 30 years. Sir Martin Donnelly is former permanent secretary at the Department of Business and Department of International Trade. He left the UK Civil Service in 2017 and spent 2 years attached to Hertford College, Oxford, lecturing and writing on trade and business issues. He currently works in the private sector. Will and Martin, thank you very much for joining us today. What I'll do now is hand over the floor to you, starting with Will.
Well, thank you. Yes, about a decade ago, I wrote The Writing on the Wall, and that was the writing on China's wall. And I felt that there was, that in the decade ahead, i.e. over the 2010s and culminating in the early 2020s, China would find itself at a crossroads. Either it would, excuse me, deliver on Deng Xiaoping's promise in the early 1980s as the Chinese reform program got underway, that China would emerge as a democracy, but with China, very much with Chinese characteristics by the 2020s, or it would remain a one-party state, trying to manage the fundamental contradictions in being a one-party state, trying to get to the frontier, the economic frontier, both in terms of technology and innovation and in terms of living standards. And what I felt was at the time that an accommodation with China was by the West, understanding that it was a very difficult process for it to manage, that actually the line that we were taking was correct, and that it was right to be as open to China as we possibly could. Today, I have to say that I think that the contradictions that the Chinese are having to manage are becoming insurmountable. I think they've been revealed by the COVID crisis, although like Taiwan and South Korea, and to a degree Japan, China has used its experience of containing SARS to good effect and actually managed to reopen its economy quite quickly. Of course, the early weeks when it was denying that the virus was as infectious as it was and disguising this from the rest of the world was a major reason why we have a global pandemic. And it's true that the World Health Organization tiptoed around that reality and should have been bolder, but perhaps couldn't have been bolder. I'm a critic of President Trump for all the reasons that that almost everyone in Europe is a critic of President Trump. But I do think that, and I think that Joe Biden, the presidential nominee for the Democrats, takes this point too, that actually one has to be extremely skeptical about China and its current intent, and robust in our relationships with it. A few words on why I am so concerned about China, the sustainability of the current Chinese model, and then a few words about how I think this is going to play out in terms of the globalization story. I mean, first and foremost, everyone, I think probably events in Hong Kong underline this. No one watching this should think that the only people in China who are rebellious about the regime are Hong Kong citizens. Underneath the surface, in most major Chinese cities, there is a similar sense of discontent. But of course, the oppressive Chinese state is able to keep it well under control. Tiananmen, whose anniversary we're celebrating only this week, is often forgotten that there were protests as big as Tiananmen in 198 Chinese cities at the same time. And the Chinese Communist Party is very well aware of that, I can tell you. The party, because its legitimacy as a single party is constantly under threat, has had to do two things, or three or four things. Firstly, the state apparatus, expensive, cannot be sustained by even moderately levels of taxation. Taxation is low to moderate in China, and the party is extremely concerned about raising it, so that the way that capital projects and indeed some current spending has been financed ever since the revolution, frankly, but increasingly since the 1980s, is by using the banking system to direct credit flows to achieve public objectives. The result is the Chinese banking system is by far the most overstretched in the world, very undercapitalized, with more than half the loans on its books non-performing. It's bankrupt. And actually, such is the scale of it that if those impaired loans ever had to be confronted, the losses would overwhelm the Chinese economy and indeed the Chinese state. But the apparatus of one-party control also has profound implications for innovation. It has profound implications actually for the way that you deal with an issue like COVID. The brave doctors who have spoken out about why the party did not react faster to this life-threatening disease and have been arrested or languishing in prison is testament to that. And believe me, the World Health Organization may want to launch, under global pressure, an international investigation into the origins of COVID, how it spread, what different countries have done, and lessons that to be learned. But trying to get anywhere in a Chinese context is going to be close to impossible. The Chinese have their line and they will stick to it. And actually, there's no prospect of independent investigation. And actually, this notion is sometimes described as a Western notion, but I regard it as a global notion following the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that one does need checks and balances, sources of kind of independent scrutiny and accountability in any functioning economy and society is one that is not respected in China. And actually, the trying ultimately to build global companies like a Huawei and others becomes very, very difficult, because actually every enterprise in China with more than 8 people, because Marx in Das Kapital said that any organization of 8 or larger is exploitative, has to have a sometimes small but kind of always vigorous kind of Communist Party committee surveying the enterprise, so that Huawei, like every other Chinese enterprise, has a party committee surveying the board. And actually, ultimately, some weaker countries who in desperate need of Chinese investment will accept that. But actually, you can't get to have global standing and actually create sinews of global economic power with such a partisan and ultimately political kind of apparatus kind of operating at the top of your globalizing companies. And the Huawei story is tribute to that, and others will follow. She has said that faced with all these problems, the Chinese are reverting to overt nationalism, what he describes as the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. And the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, he told the Party Congress recently, was to effectively end the kind of one country, two systems process, under which both Hong Kong and Taiwan, the latter always objected by China, but nonetheless that's been the de facto situation, have been allowed to kind of continue. And it's that nationalism, protecting the party and Xi as the great protector of Mother China and re-establishing China's position in the world after the century of humiliation in the 19th century, that lies behind the very obvious attempt now to establish the remit of Chinese law in Hong Kong, and the new security law making terrorism, secession, subversion kind of all criminal acts, so that even kind of jesting at the Chinese national anthem becomes a criminal act, is part and parcel of that process. And also the squaring up to Taiwan in the wake of the recent presidential election victory by a kind of anti-China nominee. What does this mean for globalization? Personally, I think that globalization and increasing trade and increasing financial flows and increasing the exchange of ideas, I think the world is condemned to it. I think one of the realities has been that the kind of globalization we've done the last 30 years requires to be revisited and rethought. It's thrown up too much kind of inequality, and companies have used it to grow kind of unaccountable corporate power, and all of that. We're going to have to reshape globalization around what I describe as European Enlightenment values. They are there actually in the UN charters, and I think those will be kind of revived and reasserted. And actually, China simply, as it stands, can't be part of that. And of course, there's a battle royal going on because China, it's the second biggest economy in the world, and it wants, if it wants the world order at best to be shaped around its leadership, at worst to accommodate the way it wants to be without complaint. But I think the rest of the world, frankly, can't accept that. There has to be some challenge to China. Of course, it can be cleverer and more deft than the challenge that President Trump is organizing, but there has to be some kind of challenge. And actually, I come back to the point I made at the beginning. Everybody on this call, I hope, should be aware that actually China, as I recall a number of Chinese citizens telling me off the record, and when I visited China, it is a volcano ready to blow. And the idea that the next 10 years will be ones in which their kind of domestic situation remains calm within China as it tries to project power abroad in the aggressive way that it's doing, I think is not going to happen. And I think that we in the rest of the world have to kind of stand for our values and stand for a kind of an economic and a global economic and social order, which is where there are actually embedded accountabilities. So that, for example, if we want international air travel to resume without quarantines, there's plainly going to have to be an internationally certificated system in which passengers get on planes and get off planes, in which everyone on the plane, and then when they arrive at their destination, the officials admitting them into the country in question are satisfied that they're not COVID carriers. And we simply can't allow that system to be one which is kind of compromised because China's concerned it might reveal weaknesses in its processes, and that is across the board. Whether you're talking about climate change, we're talking about the law of the sea, whether you're talking about intellectual property rights, whether you're talking about fifth generation 5G technologies in wireless, in all these areas, global standards and global standard setting will have to be done in a way which embodies accountabilities which actually China under Xi cannot accept. And I think COVID paradoxically may, at first sight, make China look stronger because it only suffered a 7% decline in GDP in the first quarter, whereas in Britain it will be a 15% decline, and other countries similar, even bigger than that. And it has recovered quite quickly, so that in the second and third quarters there'll be very small but positive growth, and that's going to be a stronger performance than we're going to have in Europe and the States. Notwithstanding that. And remember, those growth rates are very, very slow by China's historical standards. The figures are very dubious and much lower than they were under the derided regime of Mao between 49 and 76. So and China needs a lot of growth because it's got people flooding inland to the prosperous coast. It needs those export markets. The closing of those export markets and the slowing down of those export markets with US sanctions has hurt badly in 2019. So I think the situation over the next 5 years is extraordinarily dangerous. I think China is may look outwardly stable, but kind of internally, I think it's very unstable. And I think Xi insisting that he should have the right to be president for life, breaking the two-term rule established by Deng Xiaoping, I think was symptomatic of actually not strength, but weakness. And being bellicose in Hong Kong is a symptomatic of strength, of weakness, not strength. And that we should all prepare ourselves for a great deal of turbulence in China, and we have to be on the side of the forces that wants to construct an Asian kind of, it'll be an Asian style, it'll be a very particular Chinese style capitalism, but it will contain more accountabilities and more power centers than we have at the moment under the rule of the Chinese Communist Party. So I conclude by saying that I don't think COVID is going to lead to an increase in Chinese soft power and hard power. And paradoxically, I think that the opposite is the case, and that it will accelerate weaknesses and contradictions that are already in the system. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, thank you very much, Will, for those opening remarks. Plenty to think about, particularly the sort of weakness of Xi vis-a-vis his approach to other countries and locally. I'll now turn to Martin. Martin, you spent 3 decades in the civil service. You emerged remarkably unscathed, and you are now in the private sector. What are your remarks in response both to Will, but also your own thoughts?
Thank you. And these are obviously personal comments. I first went to China in 2004, and I have gone professionally pretty much every year since. First of all, I want to put this briefly in the context of what's been going on in the last 20 years, because the COVID crisis is really the first genuinely 21st century crisis. And over the last 20 years, China's GDP, which is very hard to measure, has gone from a bit over $1 trillion to about $14 trillion today. For comparisons, the US is about $21.5 trillion. And if you look at purchasing power parity, a lot of estimates would say that China was actually larger than the US on that measurement. The economy has also become digital and data driven. The number of cell phones has gone up from less than 1 billion 20 years ago to over 8 billion today. 4 billion regular internet users, over 1 billion broadband subscribers. And the global population has gone up by 1.5 billion people in the last 20 years. So let's remember this, we're discussing these issues against a background of absolutely massive and spectacular change in our economies, how our societies function. Over 90% of the world's data is estimated to be less than 2 years old. 2.5 quintillion bytes are created every day, and the global economy is digitally driven. And as we all know, cybersecurity is now a pressing issue for everyone. So against that background of really spectacular growth by China, relatively and in absolute terms, an economy which has gone online, and what we're doing today in terms of how we're working in lockdown would not have been possible even 5 years ago, and an institutional structure which has not changed very much since the 1940s. And I think we've got to recognize that tension between the global economic reality and the political structures which are not capable today of managing the process of where we are. I'd like to come back to that point maybe in discussion. But what does COVID do? Well, I'd highlight 3 points there. First of all, the world is going to be poorer after this epidemic is controlled. Will's mentioned reductions of 15% in GDP in the UK. We're also going to have massive sectoral distortions. How easy will it be for some sectors to recover, entertainment, leisure, and so on? How far will others, such as retail, ever come back in a non-online way? We are going to have to manage huge economic disruption with less prosperity, a lower tax base, higher public debt levels. Secondly, less organized countries around the world are going to find it more difficult to cope both with the COVID crisis and with its aftermath, when they will be expected to provide both functioning welfare systems at home and a degree of plausible commitment elsewhere that their citizens either do or do not have the virus or at risk, or that they're following certain measures. China, as a highly organized country, and not always in ways which we would want to see replicated here, will perform relatively well against that measure, but so will many other countries in Asia, but also in Europe. Thirdly, and I think inevitably, we're going to see greater government control of economic activity, because government is being forced to put public taxpayer funding into whole areas of the economy, which previously were pretty much left to the private sector. Inevitably, that funding is going to come with greater political strings, to put it crudely, and will affect how contracts are given, how trade and investment takes place, where jobs are created. And so the global economy, if you like, is going to be moving to a different, more politically driven model, at least for some years ahead. Also worth, I think, reminding ourselves that the social implications of COVID are serious and potentially long-lasting. We've seen the tragic and shocking events in the United States and the global reaction to them. We've also seen increasing evidence that COVID affects people in poorer socioeconomic circumstances disproportionately. We're also seeing evidence that women are likely to suffer economically and socially. Domestic violence issues are arising more than men. So all these issues are going to have to be dealt with, as well as the economic slow burn crisis that we're moving into. And against a background of global institutions and national politics, where there's a lot less trust and a lot more pressures for short-term populist solutions. Now, it's ironic that at a time when global trade and investment, and particularly digital interconnectivity, has been so high, that we're struggling with institutions, not just the World Trade Organization, which for 20 years has been unable to complete a trade round, but also the informal structures of the G7, G8, and more recently attempts with the G20. And it's interesting that in the 1990s, when Russia emerged from communism and the end of the Cold War, Russia was invited to join the G7. China, for a range of reasons, has never been invited to join that informal body, which provided a lot of behind-the-scenes guidance in areas from global anti-terrorist cooperation through to environment and development issues. We've not been able to come up with informal structures which incorporate new centers of economic power, of which China is clearly one, and the 20th century institutions have proved to be too rigid to deliver what we need. 10 years ago, the British government, and it wasn't alone in this, came up with a policy approach towards China, which basically said we should be trying to do three things. Within Europe, given Britain's membership of the European Union at the time, but also across the democratic world, we should be seeking, where necessary, to compete with China on an open, level playing field basis, but also recognizing the risks of intellectual property theft, risks around cybersecurity, and so on, and being prepared to manage those. We should also be prepared to make clear where our values diverged and to say so. But the second point was that it was necessary to collaborate with China because you could not resolve a range of economic problems from development, UN development goals, through to environmental and sustainability issues without sustained engagement and close cooperation with China and other developing countries, India, and so on as well. That strand of collaboration is even more relevant 10 years on if you look at the world we're in, but it's politically much less evident. And we have to ask ourselves where the responsibility for that lies. And I think one question is, can we say it is all on the side of China? And I don't think we honestly can, while recognizing the force of the points that Will has made. And competing and collaborating and then having a dialogue which recognizes the complexity of China, the 1.4 billion people, the massive increases in Chinese educational standards for girls as well as boys, men as well as women, the hundreds of thousands, now millions of Chinese who have studied abroad and come back into China, the huge diversity between the Pearl River Delta and the Northeast Rust Belt, between West China and East China, between the rice and the noodle eating areas. The fact that China has got very deep fears about the country splitting apart. And it's only a century or so since you could not send a letter across different parts of China without European support. And you can actually still buy stamps which were issued by the French or British or Germans for carrying letters from one part of China to another. You know, there is a reality there which we have to recognize. The complexity of China, its civilization, but also the issues of becoming old before they become rich, the fact that Chinese GDP per head remains relatively low, the income disparities, the pollution challenges. To say that is not to excuse political decisions or oppression which we disagree with, but it is to say that moving towards a caricature of communist China as a monolith is not just inaccurate, but dangerous for all of us in the world, and it makes managing that sort of clear-eyed collaboration and understanding what's going on within China, just as we have to ask the Chinese to understand and respect the liberal democratic standards which we try, not always very successfully, to live up to in Western countries. if we don't do that, if we move away from that, if we move towards a zero-sum game world where essentially anything that's good for China is necessarily bad for everyone else, we will not be able to manage the complexity either of the interlocked economy that we are now, I think, inevitably in and cannot come out of without huge and probably politically unacceptable disruption. And we won't be able to have a political dialogue about the serious issues on which we may disagree and where we need to at least explain why we disagree, but hopefully find a way forward. And finally, this isn't about states. It's not an image of a chessboard. It's an image of people. And an awful lot of people live in China, and an awful lot of them have come out of extremely severe poverty over the last 30 years. And that's something which we can celebrate, but we also need to accept that the 21st century world has China as a major player for good. And we need to think about how we manage that process over decades, not simply over years or months, or still less through sound bites. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you both, Will and Martin, for some fascinating and stimulating comments. We've got about 9 questions, so I'll try and turn to those as soon as I can. And in the meantime, I wonder whether viewers can help me by going to the Q&A function and voting on which they think are the best questions, and I will set them in a very democratic way. But I wonder whether I could start on something both of you referred to, which is criticism of China. Are we in danger sometimes of coming across to the Chinese, even those who may not be sympathetic to their government, as China bashers, as opposed to focusing on those specific issues? Now, I know there are a number of issues, human rights, dissent, currency manipulation, violation of intellectual property rights, to name a few. And maybe there are just too many issues that it does come across as China bashing. But how do we, our politicians, our commentators, and others, focus on the issues, human rights, treatment of religious minorities, etc., rather than coming across as China bashers? Why don't I start with Will?
It's difficult. China bashing. I'm not sure how you can react to events in Hong Kong or infringements of intellectual property or the imprisonment in concentration camps of Muslim populations in Central Asia. You can't open your mouth, frankly, without being accused by the Chinese of being a Chinese basher. Sure. And I think, your choice is either to open your mouth or stay silent, because, there's no way of actually framing these points without the Chinese leadership reacting very, very negatively. It's true, one could do more to say that, to explain that our defense of Hong Kong's very particular legal and financial system, associated as it is with self-governance, is fundamental to its prosperity. And actually that's a gain for both Asia and the world. So that, we're trying to talk about a global interest here. It is true that the language that is used by Western politicians could be more careful and could be couched differently. So it's not heard as Chinese bashing, particularly in the West, but believe me, to be heard as Chinese bashing in Beijing. Sure. You are damned if you speak up in any other way than for the current system. I'm afraid. I don't know whether Martin has a view that's different from mine.
Martin, what do you think? And could you unmute yourself?
I agree with Will that this is difficult. And I think we have to try to do 2 things. One is to stand up publicly for our values and explain why. And and when particular situations arise, for example, in Hong Kong, to explain what our concerns are, whether they are legal, whether they are moral, or whatever. But secondly, we also need to have private discussion, because that can help to avoid or minimize at least some of the polemic issues. A few years ago, China made what I thought was a major decision to allow journalists travel freely across China. This was a very important moment for deepening that dialogue and allowing people to see what China was actually like, as opposed to simply playing back the propaganda sides. We've got to encourage more of that, but recognize that, you know, we will not always succeed. I think I'll make this point conscious it can be caricatured. It does make a difference if you are starting from a position of respect rather than of, you know, let's find another one-liner to kick China. Now, that doesn't mean the response will necessarily be different, but it does over time affect the impact that you have. And I think we do have to, therefore, think about our language, because it can not just be counterproductive, but it can actually move us away from the values that we say we defend.
That's very interesting you say that, Martin. When I was a member of the European Parliament and I was leading my political group and I started a dialogue with the Chinese ambassador in Brussels, I warned all my team to be very respectful when we asked questions. And right at the end, as the Chinese ambassador rose to left, he said, "I get the feeling there were many more questions you wanted to ask, but were too respectful to ask." I thought, so even he was very aware of the fact that we were trying to be respectful. We've got about 20 minutes left. I've got 13 questions. We're not going to get through all of them. So I really do need viewers' help to vote on the questions. First question, Professor Ronald Barnett. How do you see the role of universities in the West against the background of flows of students from China, concerns over Confucius Institute's intellectual property, the enlisting of Western academics and universities into Chinese academic developments, academic freedom, and so on? Well, I'll start with you, given your role with Hartford College, but I know Martin will also have some views.
Yeah, I mean, this is really difficult. I mean, again, I think that the way we play it at Oxford is that, I mean, we literally treat the Chinese students exactly the same as all students. We have the same exacting academic demands on them. We expect them to do. We expect them to behave and to conduct themselves as you know, as students should in an academic institution in which ideas are freely exchanged and freely expressed. And I think it's important that they come, and that the fact they've come in increasing numbers, I think, reveals that there's an appetite for the kinds of education we provide. Sometimes Chinese leaders scorn the UK and say that the only things we're good for is you know, historical sites and our education system, rather as you know, European fascist leaders used to say that, you know, how many divisions has the Pope got? But actually, our universities and the kind of soft power that they impart are, I think, immensely kind of relevant. And as long as we don't compromise on, you know, who we are, and we say our, you know, our openness is an openness to all, and we welcome Chinese students on that basis. I think it works and works rather well. Whether Chinese students will carry on coming to British universities in the volumes they have, given A, our bad handling of COVID, and B, the kind of ratcheting up of tensions between Britain and China over Hong Kong, is a moot point. And I think for a lot of universities, it's going to be a big challenge to their business model. But the basic principle of accepting Chinese students, I'm sure, is right.
Martin, do you want to say anything on that?
Yeah, just 2 points. I strongly agree with Will. I think it is vital that we go on accepting Chinese students on the terms that Will said, exactly the same as everyone else. It is vital for us, frankly, and for our values as well as our economy, that Chinese students participate in research projects on exactly the same basis as everyone else, because we believe in students as individuals, not as part of some wider regimented system. And we must not allow pressure from outside to affect that. Second, just on the perception of UK in China, I talked a few years ago to some Chinese who'd come over the UK on scholarships and were now successful young professionals, and asked them what their image of the UK was, and they sort of stopped for a minute, and then one of them said, "Oh yeah, Charles Dickens," and the others said Premier League. And a few years ago, when there was an expo in Shanghai, having your photograph taken next to a life-size statue of David Beckham was a very popular piece of UK soft power.
It also shows the power of the universities when it comes to the UK soft power, doesn't it? As a quick aside, about 20 years ago when I was a younger academic and I was teaching on an MBA course, we had 160 applicants for the MBA course. And the university that I was teaching at the time took a decision not to allow 160 Chinese students in because they didn't want the course to be dominated by any one nationality. But there was a real debate about the impact on the income for the university. Now that was 20 years ago. Clearly, commercial pressures are much tougher now. It'd be interesting whether the university would have made that same decision. Next question, anonymous attendee. Quite simply, do you believe that if there is a sweeping program of reindustrialization in countries like the UK and the US as a rebuttal to Chinese domination of secondary industries, do you believe that consumers in those countries will be prepared to pay higher prices for goods produced in their own countries? For example, think of the Primark effect, for example. Once Primark reopens, there'll be lots of consumers rushing to buy Chinese-made goods from Primark rather than, say, necessarily more expensive goods produced in the West. Martin, why don't I start with you?
The answer is no.
Nice and short. Will?
I personally think that there was a book, wasn't there, by a Labour MP called Wayne Angell in 1911, famously predicting that globalization was, as it stood there, was of such benefit, and the interpenetration of national economies by our companies meant that war between Britain and Germany was inconceivable, and that consumers would never pay more for goods and services. Well, we know the outcome of that. I mean, and I'm afraid that, we know the outcome of the way British companies are kind of behaving over Brexit and keeping their mouth firmly shut, even though they know it'll be deleterious. So, I mean, I think if, and I'm not sure whether the reindustrialization supposed by the questioner is actually possible, but even if it's partially possible, and may mean higher prices, and that is the price you pay for a kind of a decision about how you want to position your national economy, that's what will happen. And actually, the politics will frame the economics. And that was true in 1911. It's true over Brexit in 2020, and it will be true if we have a partial reindustrialization.
Okay, next question from Kieran Tomlin. He asks about it appears that the British right are taking an increasingly hardline approach to China after years of encouragement of UK Sino diplomacy. Think of Osborne's lavish new golden age rhetoric. Other than the potential removal of a Huawei from our 5G network and the opening our arms to Hong Kongers, how else do you think this current increase in skepticism will be fueled by the current government? On top of that, how do you think this will be reacted to by those on the left? Wale, you said a few things about that in our conversations yesterday. Why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of these areas where, I mean, where right have a point, and I think the liberal left, of which I count myself among, have got to be very wary. I actually think that it's right to be very cautious about Huawei, and it's right to be very cautious about Chinese mercantilist ambitions. I was very concerned about the not so much the Chinese participation as a minority 25% shareholder in Hinckley, but I was very concerned that the British government, to get that participation, sold the pass so that subsequent nuclear power stations beyond the two that EDF are going to be built will be built wholly by Chinese state power companies. And I have to say that I think that if you're on the, I think the already it's extraordinary. I mean, one of the reasons for Brexit, allegedly, from Dominic Raab and that crowd, was we're going to do these global trade deals, and amongst them were going to be ones with China and ones with the United States. And they're certainly putting, to accept 3 million Hong Kong nationals and up to 3,000 in particular means the possibility of getting any kind of trade deal from China has been thrown out the window. That's not going to be the way the Chinese won't want to truck with us in that kind of framework. And I think it's the right thing to do and a brave thing to do. I think that for the left, I think it comes back to the point I made earlier. I do think that the way these things are said is terribly important. And actually, I think the left have to frame the argument not as a kind of, we want to make kind of bellicose common cause and a kind of latter-day jingoism. And anyway, China can crush Britain. What we have to say is that we are for kind of international collaboration and all the kind of things I said earlier, and actually that ultimately China benefits from that too. So I think what we'll see is not so much a kind of, this debate will play out with a shared intent, but very different language. Jingoism on the right, and actually the language of international collaboration, which the China needs to respect and values therein on the left.
Before I turn to Martin, I wonder if I could quickly come back to you. Given Trump has been at the sort of forefront, and even now Boris joined in criticism of China, do you think the left will be tempted to show sympathy with China, given their dislike of Trump and Boris?
I think that Biden in the States and Keir Starmer in Britain are too savvy to fall for that.
Okay, thank you. Martin, what are your views on that?
Well, first of all, I agree with what Will said in the previous answer, but my answer about consumers was left to themselves. I think Will's point was that politically they may not be left to themselves to make the choice. So on this one, though, I respectfully diverge a bit from Will, I think. I don't want to put it in terms of right or left. I want to put it in terms of fact or prejudice. And it seems to me the distinction is going to be between people who are prepared to look at the facts as far as we know them and draw certain conclusions, and the people who are going to choose the facts that meet their conclusions. On Huawei, for example, we have had a series of UK government engagements with Huawei over many years now, including a security center to check the content of what was made. And for a long time, this was seen as actually a rather successful model. There have been engagement with UK security agencies, and their conclusions, as far as one can see from public information, have not suggested that there is a Huawei issue. There are wider issues of cybersecurity which affect the sector. Why, therefore, do people draw certain conclusions about Huawei? I would also argue on Hinckley that people look very carefully at the potential risks. But a power station isn't something that you can take home if you feel like it. It's actually a bit of kit which is very much on place and has to meet rigorous safety standards. So, I think if we are going to move away from a fact-driven analysis of risk, whether from whichever part of the political spectrum, we're going to end up in a worse position than we need to be, economically and politically. But I would add one final point. I'm concerned that some of the language that's been used about China recently is verging on the xenophobic or racist. And I think we have to be very careful of that, because otherwise, frankly, what do our values amount to?
Thank you. A very wise point, well made. Next question, Ruth Kelly. Just to remind you, we've got about 5 minutes, so if you can help me, we're not going to get through all 10 questions, unless it's a sort of quick fire round. So I'm going to ask viewers to vote on the questions. Ruth Kelly, my colleague, a former cabinet minister, but also responsible for putting this event together. So Ruth, thank you very much for organising this event. What do you think of the actions of Hsbc and Standard Chartered in supporting the Chinese government in relation to Hong Kong? Martin, I'll start with you on that one.
Well, I think it goes back a little bit to a parallel with one of Will's comments about British business and Brexit. I think there is a real issue which we need to think about in the context of wider responsible capitalism as to what we can expect from our businesses and what we can't. We can certainly expect them to obey the laws. I think we can expect them to be good citizens. How far should we expect them to take up positions in a political arena? I think it is not reasonable to expect business to lead on this, but it is reasonable to expect business to protect its staff and to act consistently with the values that it has. Whether or not it has to make public statements, I think is something which you have to judge on a case-by-case basis. And I don't think it's fair to look to businesses to take up positions which other in public life are finding difficult to do.
Will, what do you think?
I think Standard & Chartered and HSBC were in obviously very difficult positions. They have a substantial business based in out of Hong Kong. I mean, HSBC at one point was domiciled in Hong Kong. I think they should have said nothing, and that would have been understood by the Chinese as tacit approval. By actually saying something publicly, they put themselves on the wrong side of history. That said, I mean, both companies have they built their businesses over decades and arguably over centuries in actually being prepared to do business with whatever regime on the mainland. And I guess that was the prevailing voice in their boardrooms. We must be hyper pragmatic at a moment of tension like this. I do know, and talking privately to businessmen in Hong Kong, and they will say things to you like, well, look, frankly, what you don't realize is you can say and do a great deal more in the mainland actually than is let on. And actually it'll be perfectly livable with in reality. And we just can't carry on with the scale of street protest that is killing Hong Kong as a place to do business at the minute. So they find themselves to be security minded as well. But I regret the fact that they've spoken out as they have. I'm not surprised, but it underlines what I said earlier. Politics leads economics.
And maybe it also leads to increasing skepticism of big business as well. We've got about 3 minutes left. I'm only going to be able to squeeze in one quick question, asking for quick answers from Will and Martin. Apologies to everyone else who had about 9 open questions. We haven't been able to get to your questions, but thank you very much. And Nick Moore managed to get into the playoffs just before the end of the season, as it were. Can you make any estimate of the likelihood of China attempting to take control in Taiwan, whether by force, intimidation, or other means? Will, I'll start off with you.
I think China. I think the Chinese leadership is increasingly reckless. I think that they calculate that the United States would be very unlikely if they do invade Taiwan to defend Taiwan. I think they want to. They are hell-bent on this project of, as I said in my opening, national rejuvenation. That does. And I thought that it was very ominous what she said in before Christmas about reserving rights to do anything that he chose. Nationalism is a very, very potent force in all countries, particularly in China. And I would not exclude, I've always thought that actually China, along with the West Bank and the kind of, and the Indian-Pakistan border is one of the world's great flashpoints. And that remains my view. And actually, for me, it's going up in salience as a major risk.
Martin.
Well, I very much agree with Will on the Kashmir, India-Pakistan border as an extremely worrying flashpoint. I think just briefly on Taiwan, this is not a new issue, and the position are very clear. The level of economic interdependence between Taiwan and the mainland has continued to grow. I do not expect military action in that area. I think China's very long tradition of caution militarily will continue, and there are very strong reasons for it to do so. I hope I'm right.
Well, Martin,
I hope you're right too. But remember Wayne Angel.
And I think, and that was such a long time ago that he wrote that. And also, thank you, thank you both to Will Hutton and Sir Martin Donnelly for joining us today. Can I thank you all who are watching today for joining us? I hope you found it as fascinating as I did. I'd also like to thank my St Mary's colleagues who put this event together in the background to make it run as smoothly as it did. Please don't forget, if you're interested in studying at St Mary's University or interested in learning more about our wide range of programs in business, sport, law, drama, humanities, education, and theology at the undergraduate and postgraduate level, you can find out more information on our website, www.stmarys.ac.uk. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook at Your St Mary's or on LinkedIn. Thank you for joining us today. Please stay safe, and we hope to see you at a future St Mary's University webinar in the future. Thank you.